Okay, so I'd like to introduce Virginia Sanchez, who's our speaker for today. Virginia Sanchez is an independent historian who enjoys research. Her articles have appeared in the New Mexico Magazine, La Herencia, and in historical, cultural, and genealogical journals such as Colorado History, the New Mexico Genealogist, and the Colorado Hispanic Genealogist. Virginia is a member of the Colorado Historical Society, the New Mexico Historical Society, the Huerfano County Historical Society, and the Colorado Society of Hispanic Genealogy. Her ancestors were among the first soldiers, colonists to settle the Spanish province of New Mexico in 1598. Today, she's going to be making a presentation on her book, Pleas and Petitions. Some of you, I know some of our members have seen her in person. She made a presentation on the Espinosa brothers, which was excellent. So she's written quite a few books. One of them was on the Espinosa brothers. This one is Pleas and Petitions. It's about the territory of Colorado, and it's an in-depth history of the Hispano socio-political political life during this time. So anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Virginia, and I hope you enjoy. Go ahead and share, Virginia.
Okay. Good morning. I'm very grateful to be here to talk to you about my book today, Pleas and Petitions. And I also wanted to say just a correction, Carmen, that the information on the Espinosa brothers is in this book, Pleas and Petitions. There is not a separate book for the Espinosa brothers. I included them in this book because there's a chapter there on the violence that had occurred against the Hispanos of Southern Colorado during the territorial period. So that information again is going to be in this book. Many of you have already seen, I'm going to get rid of this thing. I think that's what does it there. Many of you have already either have seen part of the information that's in this book on the Espinosa brothers, but also some of these slides may be familiar. But in today's presentation, I'm going to show you some different things. I don't want to tell you what's in the book. I'd like you to read it. And after you read it, I think you're going to find that it's an important book that we need in because it documents our history. And a lot of this information is new information that has been researched. Let's see, the other thing I wanted to mention was that the information that you'll see on this screen is just a taste of what you're going to read about, okay? So I'll give you the overview, and then anyway, you can ask questions later and whatnot. So we'll go ahead and get started. So in 1859, the miners started coming in, and this is what really started to impact what was going on in the West as far as the congressional delegation was concerned. They decided that they wanted a square state in the middle of a map of the United States. So when the miners came out, they started to create Jefferson County, and they included in that map what was Taos and Mora counties. And that area somewhat became the notch, what we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I'm just introducing some terms to you right now. Now, obviously, before the miners came in, the Hispano settlers had been in as early as the 1850s. But unfortunately, Congress and the United States paid more attention to the miners than they did to us. So this shows that in 1861, Congress received its square state in the middle of a map. And it's not really a square, but anyway, in the congressional report, it's listed as square. So it took area from 4 territories to create this square, and they named it Colorado Territory in 1861. Now at the bottom here, you'll see that there's the notch of New Mexico, and that impacted 7,000 Hispanos. They were Spanish speakers, they were Catholic, they were rich in tradition and culture, and they had been in the area for quite a while now, and this area had been explored and whatnot, so it was not really a new area to them. It's just that there were a lot of Indian incursions, so that's why they didn't remain in the area early on. So one morning on February 28th, they discovered that they were in a new territory, and this territory was only English speaking, and its legislative assembly only conducted itself in the English language. So this was very difficult for them. So we'll go on with that. I'll explain some more things. So obviously the Conejos land grant and the Sangre de Cristo land grant were issued in the 1840s. At least the Sangre de Cristo grant, excuse me. Then in 1860, the Surveyor General's office was established in New Mexico. So we find that now the Conejos grant people had found out that they needed to resubmit to their petition for congressional approval for confirmation. And they had been submitting it to New Mexico until the Colorado Surveyor General was established later on, I think in 1862. Now, the Conejos land grant was a community land grant, and it remained unconfirmed even until the Colorado statehood period. So the Sangre de Cristo land grant was confirmed early. Charles Beaubien obviously knew that he, well, I'm sure he had information about it, so he right away got his application in and got it confirmed. Now his was an individual land grant, and you'll learn that in the you may know that in the with the Taos Revolt in 1847, his son, who was partial owner of the land grant, had died, and therefore Charles Beaubien owned his portion. Charles later purchased the other owner's portion, and he became the sole owner of the Sangre de Cristo grant. Now settlers then had to receive his permission to go on to the Sangre de Cristo grant. Okay, so Colorado started in 1861. Everything starts getting going. It has an election to elect councilmen, which are really senators, and representatives of each county so that they could establish their territorial assembly. Then this is the territorial seal. I wanted to show this to you because at one time this Italian motto was going to be Spanish, and they had a discussion about that. It's an interesting discussion, and obviously they lost. Governor Gilpin at the time had wanted a Latin motto. So the new territory now had new laws, which were taken mostly from Missouri and Kansas legislatures. Now, Governor Gilpin at least knew that New Mexico had its own legislature in place, and it was a bilingual legislature. So it had also established the office of translator, and it was a paid office. That translator would translate the bills from Spanish to English or English to Spanish as needed. And so Governor Gilpin most likely knew this information, but the executives of the territory, the territorial secretary, the governor, and the other officers should have known that they could have taken some laws from New Mexico, or at least some legislative documents that might help some of the Spanish-speaking legislators. But anyway, they didn't. They mostly took these laws and enacted them right away, one right after another, from Missouri and Kansas. And as I said, the sessions were held in English and the laws were printed in English, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. later. During this time, we had the Civil War beginning. So everything is going on. We've got Colorado being a pro-union, and they were very, very afraid of encroachment from the Texas Confederates from the South. So the federal government, as well as the new territory, needed a tax revenue to help, well, on the federal side, obviously, to fund the war, and on the territorial side, to build roads and whatever infrastructure that was needed. So because of the Civil War, we needed men to enlist, and we needed provisions to help equip the troops. Some of you are familiar with this diagram, and all I'm trying to say that in southern Colorado, we had all of these different issues taking place. I'm not going to talk too much about the Ute Indians today, but there is a chapter on that that's very important about what was happening, especially in Conejos during this time. So I'll go ahead and keep going with this. So the Hispano concerns very early were obviously to keep their land, and they were concerned about the Colorado laws. They weren't published in Spanish, so they had no idea what was going on. They knew that they were being taxed, but they weren't told what the tax was for, or what would happen if they didn't pay them. Then there was this violence that was occurring. I don't know whether you can see all of this, but it was documented violence against Representative Francisco Gallegos. And unfortunately, the only thing that we know about this is that one morning they found him on the Conejos Plaza with a rope around his neck. And that's all that appears in the newspaper. So we're supposed to imply that either he was hung, or he committed suicide, or something else. But I think during, because of the period and the violence that was taking place at the time, I believe that he was hung. Then we have the violent killing of the Espinosa brothers. We have this, during this territorial period, we have the Tefilo Trujillo homestead that was, he had his sheep burned, sheep mutilated, his house burned, lots of atrocities that had happened to him simply because there were some Texas cattlemen who wanted to purchase his land. And then we have 13-year-old Donaciano Sanchez, who was hung by the neck. And this mob violence that occurred against him included Otto Mears and Isaac Gotthelf. And those are important names in another area of Colorado, but Otto Mears is the big road builder for the mountains, into the mountains. So he was this bigwig, basically. Now, during the same time I was telling you about, the Anglos were concerned because the Hispanos were having these secret meetings. And in these secret meetings, they speak Spanish. And so the Anglos don't know what they're speaking about. And so they start to worry that this is going to be some kind of an insurrection. But in reality, the Hispanos were probably forming a petition because they wanted to return to New Mexico. Excuse me. So because they wanted to return to New Mexico, they turned to New Mexico, the New Mexico Assembly, to get its support in their petitions. The New Mexico Assembly put forth this resolution that basically said, for the inhabitants of Costilla and Culebra, and I think it says Conejos there in the other one. We again, what is that? I can't read it. I'm going to kind of, so Tom, will you please read this for me? For the inhabitants of
Conejos, Costilla, and Culebra to return again to this territory due to the critical situation that they find themselves, lack of legal administration of justice, laws in a language they do not understand.
And then they cannot do some other things. So obviously the legislature was supporting them. So part of that, the petitions went to Congress, and Congress took a look at it, but obviously didn't do anything with that first petition. Then during this same time that they were submitting this first petition, there was a need for laws to be printed in Spanish. So the two representatives, Jose Victor Garcia and Jesus Maria Varela, asked Donaciano, oh, I can't remember his last name all of a sudden. But anyway, Donaciano, I'll get to it a little later. I'm having a brain snap here. But anyway, he was able to write in Spanish and in English, so he penned this English letter to the government, to the federal government, and this is their response. I'll have somebody read that too for me.
The custom of the government has been to encourage foreign-born citizens to acquire a knowledge of our own language. Laws have been printed in the English language only except in New Mexico.
Okay, and it was in New Mexico where they are, and it goes on about being Spanish-born and their customs and traditions. So what this man did not understand, his name is Elijah Whittlesey, and he was the federal secretary, basically. He did not understand that by 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe, the people that remained, these Hispanos especially, were United States citizens. And they had been removed from being in New Mexico territory into Colorado territory. So he obviously didn't understand the history there. But anyway, he responds in this letter to the Colorado congressional delegate. And unfortunately, when the Colorado delegate received this letter, he didn't support the Hispanos. He didn't come back to Whittlesey and say, oh, you're right, they are citizens. You're wrong, excuse me. They are citizens. They deserve to have the language, the laws in their language. And they're not recent arrivals, basically. So that's a very unfortunate thing that happened. Okay, so then during 1863, we have charges that are being brought up against Lafayette Head. These are just some of the things that I'm kind of enforcing you to understand that it is, asking you to understand that there were so many things happening around the Conejos, Costilla County areas. In 1863, charges are being brought up against Lafayette Head. And there's a big hearing that's being held, and the Hispanos have a translator, and it's all documented, which is like 50 pages. It's really interesting, and I kind of summarize it in my book. But overall, nothing happens to Head because the new governor, John Evans, decides that he's an okay guy, and we're okay. Now, history has recorded that Lafayette Head was a friend of the Hispanos, but this information, these charges obviously indicate that he was not a friend to the Hispanos. He had started to do some malicious things, and they wanted him removed. So they were busy doing these petitions to remove him as agent. Then in 1863, you have the United States coming into Conejos. Major Archibald Gillespie is there to do a military muster to determine the number of men available for conscription into the Army. So he wants to induct people into service, men into service. And then he also wants to determine the types of food stores and provisions that could be confiscated for use by the U.S. Army. So this is an example of this Plaza of San Judas de Tadeo, but I want to show you the original. I don't know if you can see that. Is that big enough for you? You can't probably read it, but here, item number 3 is Felipe Espinosa, 38. That's women, children, and then arms. He has a carbine and a half a pound of ammunition. Then Viviana Espinosa, here, 30 years old, doesn't show him owning any rifles or arms and ammunition. Now this one also comes back here, and it'll tell you how many mills are in that area, in that little plaza, how many wagons they have, how many food stores, blah, blah, blah. And here, in this particular census, it's not detailed. And there are tables in the book that actually show you for the two plazas a real good itemization of what they had. Those two plazas were the plaza of San Judas de Tadeo and then San Juan Nepomuceno. And also the third census that you'll find is the whole abstract for the Conejos area. And when I say Conejos area, that is the river settlement areas, the plazas along that river settlement. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Anglos were fearing an insurrection, but according to the military census that I mentioned for the district of Conejos, we find that for the whole area, there were only 222 items in the armament and only 135 pounds of powder. So even looking at those statistics, then we'll find that they had no, in no way were they able to perform any kind of insurrection, because they just didn't have the manpower, number one, nor the arms and ammunition to enforce one. And you'll also find that there were muskets during this time, so that's pretty interesting. Muskets didn't use powder, that used little, what do you call them, balls. Think of a cannonball in a very small size. Okay, so the next year, in 1864, finally, after the Whittlesey event, John Evans, the governor, says, no, we need to print these laws in Spanish. And during the same time, Colorado Territory citizens had submitted a petition for statehood, but the Hispanos kept voting it down, and it was through their block that this statehood initiative in the early 1860s was eliminated, I'll say. So this is the general laws of the assembly for the territory, and this is the one in English, excuse me, in Spanish, and it was for the 1864 laws. So I wanted to mention that these included the laws of 1861 and 1862, and in 1864. Now there was no session in 1863 because the territorial treasury had no money in it. So that's why these taxes were important, yes, but you know, you've got to sell the people on what's going to happen with the revenue that you need. So anyway, Governor Evans then just decided, well, we're going to have a legislature. Now, that information did not get, well, part of that information did not get into Southern Colorado timely enough, because at one point, Conejos County wanted to change its county seat from one location to another. And then after they had a vote, it was discovered that because it was conducted in 1863, it was invalid. So they were, again, by their votes, they were not able to change their county seat. And I also want to explain that there were no repealed laws within these statutes for these 3 years. And that's important, because when you make a law and then all of a sudden change it, you know, they weren't informed of the changes, so they were acting or responding to older laws or something. So again, this is an unfairness for them. Excuse me. Here is Francisco Perea. He is, excuse me, he is the congressional delegate from New Mexico. Now, territorial delegates could not be on the floor of the Congress to speak because they were only territorial delegates. They weren't full-fledged state delegates. So Francisco had to act with the mediator to try to get his legislation passed or introduced. So this is a letter that he had sent to Honorable Ashley, the chairman of the Committee on the Territories in the House. And this letter basically just says that New Mexico lost its citizens to Colorado, and they want to be returned. Now, Ashley had informed Perea in 1865 that the committee was ready to support Perea. However, it was the end of the session, so we'd have to wait until the next congressional session. So that was a big blow, a very big blow. Okay, so then in 1865, I'm just going chronologically here for you, we have Lafayette Head, who's doing his Indian census. And in this, he's telling the government who these Indians are, who are owned by Hispanos. Incidentally, Lafayette Head failed to mention at least 6 Anglos who owned Indian slaves. And the Hispanos were angry with Lafayette Head submitting this census because they felt this was in retribution to the petitions they had signed to try to get rid of him. All right, so we moved 2 years to 1867 and 1872. We have on the left-hand side here, this book included the laws of 65 through 71. And again, it had no repealed laws in it. And then the laws weren't published again until 1872. Now, so I'm trying to, just emphasize that they were not getting the most current information about the laws that were in effect. Then by 1875, we have the Constitution for statehood, the Constitution, and this tells Congress what the state is now going to do if the congressional parties would allow it to be a state. Now, in order to be a state, the territory had to have at least 60,000 people in residence, and certainly by 1875, Colorado Territory did have that kind of population. Now, I'm going to ask, who gets, today, who gets the notoriety for getting the laws published in Spanish during the statehood period? Does anybody know? Can you raise your hands? And Tom or Carmen, can you let me know who's asking and what the response is?
I don't see anybody.
Nobody? Okay. Does Casimiro Varela sound familiar? Anybody shaking their head yes? Okay. Casimiro Varela had submitted a bill in 1875 so that if, or with this Constitution, that the bills would be published in Spanish and in German until I believe 1912 maybe. And so in history books, we find that Casimiro Varela gets the credit for doing that. But we have to go back and look at the prior Hispano representatives who had tried to get these laws published in Spanish from as early as 1861. Okay, so I wanted to mention that. Now, Casimiro Dominguez, he was the man who wrote the letter that went to Whittlesey for the laws in 1862. I think you remember that I showed you that letter. Anyway, Casimiro Dominguez, or Celestino Dominguez, I'm sorry, Celestino Dominguez was actually from Spain, and he must have moved into California and then came to Colorado. But you know, his history is really like a ghost. We don't know how he appeared or when he left. But anyway, he was the one that helped translate the Constitution of the state of Colorado into Spanish. And he worked with another translator on that. He was, by 1863 and 1864, a councilman, which is equivalent to a senator of the territory of Colorado. And he was very influential in trying to get, again, the laws passed in English. This is an 1874 photo of conejos that I wanted to show you. And then during this territorial period, you have the territorial newspapers that are promoting immigration from the east. And, you know, Colorado has these rich ores and land that's available. And they keep promoting the land that is already cultivated and watered by hand-dug acequias. So, you know, it's a sad story, actually. But anyway, during the early period, then Colorado had a problem with the low population. So it wasn't until 1875 that we were able to get statehood into 1876. There were vigilance committees, as I mentioned, with the hangings of Representative Gallegos, 13-year-old Donaciano Sanchez, and even the burning of the home of Tefilo, Trujillo. So we have a lot of violence, and I have a table that includes the number and some documented instances that you might be interested in reading about. So there were a lot of prejudicial sentiments. And then now the editors would automatically print these correspondence because, of course, they wanted to sell papers. They wanted to promote their ideas, and they were really hot on statehood. So I don't know how much time I have left, but anyway, I wanted to again introduce you to Pleas and Petitions, Hispano Culture and Legislative Conflict in Territorial Colorado. The book is available at the El Pueblo Museum, or will be available at the El Pueblo Museum and at other bookstores. And in the book, you'll see some other maps and historical photos, a biography of the territorial Hispano legislators. Now, it does not include the biography of all of the territorial Hispanos, but those that I could find, and it includes some photos of them. And then it includes a timeline of Hispano Colorado. And I thought this would be helpful because it helps to see how everything kind of focused in on Southern Colorado with the U.S. Army and the Civil War, the U.S. Army based at Fort Garland, and how they were getting recruits in and out. So there was a lot of military movement that was in the area. Recruits would come in, and then they'd be forwarded to Fort Union, and then from Fort Union they'd come back into Fort Garland, and then up to various other forts depending on what was going on. We have yes, what I could do is, so I'm trying to just basically say that it includes information about the actual insurrection that they thought was an insurrection, the land grants, what had happened with the Beaubien document, that it's important. That is when Beaubien was dying, and he decided to make deeds for all of those he had allowed onto his land. Well, anyway, that was a good thing, right? Because then you'd have a land deed, that a piece of paper that's yours that says that you own this land. The problem was that Colorado law and federal law said that you have to have certain information on the deed, which includes your full Christian name, not just Jesus Maria Gonzalez, when the full Christian name of that person was Jose Jesus Maria de Gonzalez, okay? Also, it had to have the actual dimensions or locations of the, or what is it called, a plat map that actually indicates where your endpoints are for your property. So anyway, that Beaubien document was null, and these people lost their land. We have more information about the miners. The miners were very important to Colorado because they were bringing in revenue, and it was important to the U.S. military because it was able to fund the war. So I mentioned the Colorado laws, and I mentioned the Civil War. I think we're caught up here, so I'm at the end. Oh, I did want to mention that your library now has a copy of Nación Genízara, and this discusses the enslaved Indians that are on Lafayette Head's enumeration here on the far right, and it goes into detail. This chapter, which is my chapter, Chapter 8, Survival of Captivity, is the longest chapter in this book. But anyway, I have donated a book to your library, and so I just wanted to mention that to you.
It's a very good book. I read the whole thing.
So thank you very much, Virginia. I'm sure that our participants have questions. I know you have to write your questions on chat, and this is new for us, so you know, be patient with us as we work through this. But if you have a question,
the first question here is, where did you do your research?
Okay, I did my research at the Colorado History Museum, and then later on I found out that they had their Colorado magazines online. So I was able to do a lot of online search within their Colorado magazines, and these were very helpful for the period. From there, then I looked at the information on the legislators in the Denver Public Library, got photos from both the library and History Colorado's library. While I was in Virginia for 3 years, I was able to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., as well as in Maryland. And lo and behold, that is when I found where is the petition? Oh, excuse me. There was where I was able to find the 3 petitions. Not the 3 petitions, but the I was able to find the information on the hearing against Lafayette Head, the one document that I said was about 50 pages. And I was able to find these abstracts of 2 plazas, as I mentioned, and the whole Conejos district. So it was just a real eye opener. I was so happy that you know, fate had taken me there.
Okay, the next question is there one or many places for sources on Beaubien? Okay,
you're going to see some land grant documents, copies of land grant documents in the book also, and those are from the History Colorado Museum. And you know, there's a copy of the Beaubien document that asks, or you know, gives everybody their deeds and whatnot. So I just you know, looked everywhere that I could for some information. It was interesting because I kept asking a lot of questions about early Colorado, or especially early Southern Colorado, and that led me to get determined to write this book.
Okay, the next question is, was it Donaciano Vigil that you talked about earlier? Tell me more research on lynching of Mexicans, especially that young boy, Donaciano Sanchez.
All right, Donaciano Sanchez. Well, it's a bit of a long story, but it's documented in John Lawrence's book. And we were able to find information that said that one night John Lawrence is invited to this meeting. So he goes to this heart cell house where they're having this meeting, and these men are talking about Donaciano Sanchez and how He supposedly had stolen a horse and all of the horse fittings, and must be caught. And so Donaciano, these men then went out looking for Donaciano. He ran from one house to another. He was caught under the bed in one house and pulled out. Then the sheriff had taken Donaciano to the jail. He was charged and taken to the jail, and I'm trying to think. Mob members or vigilantes had come in and removed him from the jail. And the sheriff had been watching over, but he was overtaken. It's almost like one of the horrible TV programs we used to watch, Bonanza, in the 50s and 60s. But anyway, they had grabbed him and they hung him. John Lawrence and his Navajo Indian, Gabrielle Woodson, who was actually owned by James Woodson, found Donaciano hung by a tree next to the river, and they brought him down and they had a burial service for him. Now, so there was no trial. There were no trials. Interestingly enough, the justices for the territorial Supreme Court were selected by the president, and nominated and selected, and they were brought over. So, but many of them were for the East, so they knew nothing of southern, the southern part of the United States. And in 1862 and 1863, these justices were moved from one area to another. And there were three areas, Denver, the mines, and southern Colorado. Anyway, they lost the justice in southern Colorado because he was transferred into the mines area. So southern Colorado was without a justice for a number of years. And we have all of this violent activity.
Okay, the next question is, where was the location of the Tefilo Trujillo property that was destroyed?
I will look that up while we get to another question. How's that?
Okay, next question is, where can I find a copy of Colorado State Constitution in Spanish? Also, who translated the Constitution?
You can't. All that's there is the cover, or if it's available, it's at the Supreme Court building. Now, interestingly enough, we should have a copy that it's written in Spanish, right? But we don't. And I'm not sure that the German one is available either. And I propose that because Celestino Dominguez had translated that Constitution from English to Spanish, and then they submitted it to the printer. So once it came back from the printer, the original was gone. And that's really unfortunate. A lot of our documents were discarded that way. So we don't.
Okay, another question is, did the Catholic Church play a significant role?
Yes, and it did, but it is not part of my book only because I was trying to keep church and state separate.
Okay. The next one is, my great-grandfather Clemente Trujillo, senator for territory and representative for states. So this is very interesting. This is from Diane Broda. Do you have any stories about Donaciano Vigil?
Donaciano Vigil. He was the state representative?
He was territorial governor of the state of New Mexico.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I don't have a lot of information on him. I'm sorry.
The next question is, PHM able to sell her book, or is that Virginia's decision?
PHM?
I'm not sure what PHM is.
The Heritage Museum, the Pueblo Heritage Museum.
No, it could sell the book. All it needs to do is their director or their director just needs to contact the University of Colorado Press, and make arrangements for books.
Which reminds me, you are having a book sale and signing up in Denver, aren't you?
Right, on the 20th, we're having a book sale and signing at 2300 South Patton Court in Denver, and that's from 10 to 12. And then I'm going to check my email because I'm supposed to have some information for you, Tom, so that you can get some information to your members about another way that they can get books, okay?
Great, great. And it looks like the last question is, can you talk about who was and who was not allowed to vote in Colorado between 1861 and 1876?
Okay. Colorado executives had submitted a document in Spanish, in English, that actually told people that anyone of Mexican descent who, by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was a United States citizen and who was over 18 years old could vote. And these were only males at the time. And a copy of that document is in the book.
Okay, and that's,
let's see, Teofilo Trujillo's land was in Conejos County, and I'm trying to look at the, I don't know, it was a valuable piece of land. I'm sorry, I can't find it real fast. I think there's some kind of a river, or not a river, but some kind of a lake that's nearby, and I can't remember at the time, I'm sorry.
so Carmen says, so Mexican women were not allowed to vote?
No, we were not allowed to vote until 1920, isn't it the 100-year celebration for women's vote?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Bob says that they will be selling your book at the Pueblo Heritage Center.
Great, thank you, Bob. And I wanted to show a picture of Teofilo Trujillo. Can you see it?
Not quite. I think the background is messing up.
Okay, all right.
Okay, thank you very much, Virginia. We really appreciate your presentation. You know, I know I, for one, learned a lot. And to the FACC members, you know, we are going to be doing this again. This was our first time. I think hopefully we did pretty well, you know, considering this was our first time. Our next Zoom meeting is going to be next month. It's going to be July 11th at 11 a.m. Eric Carpio, who's the curator at the Fort Garland Museum in Colorado, he's going to be speaking on the impact of Fort Garland on Southern Colorado.